Here we speak with Dr. Ralph Kilmann. He's a conflict management expert and co-creator of the renowned Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, aka TKI, and it's the world's best-selling conflict management tool.
I'm neither trying to get my needs met or your needs met. Now, there's good times to avoid. When tension is high, when stress is high, people can't talk, people can't think. Cool off, get back together another time. Wow, that sounds great, but how do we do that? Well, you have to have trust. You have to take the time to have a discussion. You have to share what you really need or want. You have to communicate effectively. You have to actively listen. It has to be a very important issue. You wouldn't want to spend time on collaborating if it was a trivial issue.
And here's an insider's brief about mastering conflict management that goes beyond theory. In today's world where differences, diversity, and discord prevail, conflict management has become an essential skill for individuals, teams, and societies. You know what I'm talking about. Well, here we speak with Dr. Ralph Kilmann. He's a conflict management expert and co-creator of the renowned Thomas-Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, aka TKI, and it's the world's best-selling conflict management tool. This is very exciting. Hi, Ralph, and welcome to the Tony DUrso Show.
Hi, Tony. It's a delight to be here. Thank you so much.
It's my honor to have you to talk about this. Is very important subject here. The world is definitely more and more contentious. You have to mind your P's and Q's everywhere. I'd like to start from the top, please. What made you work on solving conflicts?
Well, I did my undergraduate and master's at Carnegie Mellon in the 1960s, and there were a couple of professors working in the area of conflict, but I didn't pay much attention to it. It wasn't a major topic. It's not what was discussed in the news. It was something that was discussed perhaps in a sociology class or political science or psychology, but it was not mainstream. But then I went for my doctorate at UCLA, and that is where I met Ken Thomas, who was finishing up his dissertation on conflict management. And I was working on instrument development. I like the idea of how do you measure these very obvious and yet very obtuse and very abstract concepts and make them meaningful for people? How do you measure that and give a number to it so it means something? And basically, Ken and I got together to develop this instrument, the TKI, and making use of all his knowledge about conflict management, what I knew about instrument development. It was a perfect combination. And we also got along very well. In fact, I've told people, even if we didn't work on that instrument in conflict management, we still would have been friends. We just clicked.
You dealt with your conflicts if you had any.
Right. But I should say that at that time, it was not a popular topic. And Ken and I have to say, we did not anticipate how the world would change. The globalization, the global village, the deregulation, the political, the social media that connects everything in the world instantaneously, that shrinks the world. And because of diversity in the workplace, across the board, there is more and more conflict. And what's clear, if we don't learn how to manage conflict, we can't move forward. And we remain stymied in what we're doing, and we're stuck in the past. That was not the case perhaps in the early 70s, but the world has changed dramatically.
Can you tell us about the TKI conflict model?
I'd be happy to. It's based on two dimensions. One is called assertiveness, and that's on the y-axis that goes up and down. And assertiveness is the extent to which I try to get my needs and concerns met in a conflict situation. On the x-axis, which goes from left to right, is cooperativeness. And that's the extent to which I try to get your needs and concerns met in the situation. So this combination of trying to get my needs and concerns met versus getting your needs and concerns met create the conflict management space, and they define 5 conflict modes, 5 basic approaches whenever there's conflict.
Let me get my brain around this. There's 5 conflict modes, but there's 2 skill sets around this?
There are 2 dimensions that define those 5 conflict modes. So, for example, competing, that is high assertiveness, low cooperativeness. I'm trying to get my needs met. I'm not at all concerned about your needs. I'm asserting myself, what we call competing. The opposite of that we call accommodating. I'm not at all concerned about getting my needs met. I want to help you get your needs met. In the middle is compromising, where we flip a coin or take a middle ground so you get some of your needs met, not all of them, and I get some of my needs met, but not all of them, but at least it's a workable solution, at least for the time being. Then there's avoiding, which is low on both assertiveness and cooperativeness. I'm neither trying to get my needs met or your needs met. Now, there's good times to avoid. When tension is high, when stress is high, people can't talk, people can't think. Cool off, get back together another time. Or if you need to collect more information or talk to a few more people before you make a final decision, that's when avoiding is good. But if you're avoiding when something is very important to you and the other person, well, then over time, you're not getting your needs met. And you're either going to disengage from the situation or you're simply going to leave. And the fifth conflict mode, which seems like the ideal, but it only works well under a very specific set of conditions. That's collaborating. And collaborating is high on assertiveness and high on cooperativeness. It's coming up with an approach where you get all your needs met and I get all my needs met. Wow, that sounds great, but how do we do that? Well, you have to have trust. You have to take the time to have a discussion. You have to share what you really need or want. You have to communicate effectively. You have to actively listen. It has to be a very important issue. You wouldn't want to spend time on collaborating if it was a trivial issue. So those conditions have to be there for there to be this magical collaboration where everyone gets their needs met. But because there's more and more conflict, we are constantly making choices about, well, how do I approach this? How are my needs versus your needs? How do we do this? And that's the skill set that we need to develop.
While you're saying this in the different modes or models, excuse me, I'm thinking in the corporate world where I've worked a good many years, several decades. One method was, I don't want to argue with it, is what I'm thinking, or the person's thinking, I'll just walk away. I'll just leave it at that. Don't want to argue. It gets stressful, the situation. It's like, I don't want to argue. And you see this where it looks like it's going to be contentious and somebody just walks away or just doesn't say anything more. It's not necessarily the best, and there is still that stress. I'd like to know, what advice do you have to help with that?
Well, I have found, to first put this in a larger perspective, that many organizations today have an avoiding culture. And it's supported by the reward system. So if an employee challenges his or her boss again and again, you're going to hear about it in your performance review, because there's norms like don't make waves, don't rock the boat, don't step on the toes of senior management, which results in an avoiding culture. In fact, the instrument that Ken and I developed, the TKI, measures your tendency to use those 5 modes. And when we do that with people in organizations, we find that people on top of the hierarchy, when we ask them, how do you resolve conflict in this organization? They come out higher on the assertiveness modes, compromising, competing, collaborating. But as you move down the hierarchy, more and more avoiding and accommodating, because they have learned it's not helpful to stick your neck out, take a chance, and tell people what you really feel. It's easier, as you suggested, to walk away. That may be easier, but that affects long-term success. You can't solve important problems by walking away from the discussion. In fact, senior management, when they see the results of the TKI up and down the hierarchy, they say, my goodness, we're paying people all these salaries and we're not getting their input. They're not telling us what they really feel. We're not taking advantage of their wisdom, expertise, and their talent. So when you have a situation where it's an important thing like strategic direction, like how we organize this work, how we work on this project, if there's conflict, if we walk away from it, we won't be able to achieve anything. So we have to learn how to change the culture. In fact, the major principle I've learned in the last 50 years is that 80% of what behavior is observed in an organization is driven by the surrounding systems: culture, strategy, the reward system, structure. Only 20% is based on individuals' personal preferences to behave a certain way. We don't realize the power of the system. But what happens is if you replaced all the people in the organization with other people, in 3 months, you'd have the same conflict, the same conversations, the same approach, because it's the systems that put people in conflict. Like department, one department values quality. Another one is worried about cost. Another one is worried about this, is worried about that. They're in conflict. Well, we have to resolve that. And that comes from the organization. You put different people in those departmental jobs, and they'll have the same conflicts year after year. So it's mostly in the systems. And that's why a lot of my work on organizational change is, if we want better conflict management, we can't just do individual training in an isolated workshop and then throw people back into an organization which says, don't take chances by really expressing yourself. Keep to yourself, walk away from trouble. So we have to do more than try to help individuals learn about conflict. We have to change the surrounding systems so they can use the different conflict modes as needed.
Totally get you on all of this. Now, we're all entrepreneurs and business people here. We're listening into this show. Can you tell us about some of the tools that you have that can help us in the working world to deal with all of this?
Well, the main tool, and that's the reason why Ken Thomas and I developed the TKI, is in roughly about 15, 20 minutes. It's a self-report. You're asked to respond to various items according to how you usually behave in conflict situations. And then the results are, you find out which conflict modes you might be using too much or too little as compared to a large normative sample. So you take the TKI and you may find out, my goodness, I'm really high on competing and I'm very low on accommodating. I never thought about that. That must mean that I'm concerned about my needs and I don't really work well and have empathy on what other people need. Maybe that's why I haven't been able to resolve things and why everyone doesn't want to work with me all the time. Or you may find out I'm highest on avoiding and lowest on competing. I just learned over years not to assert myself. It's just not worth it. But once you see the results, you say, is this effective for me in an organization, let alone in my personal life and my family? So often you find out you're high or you're very high on one or two modes and very low on the others. And it's saying you're only relying on the same mode again and again. Like if you're high on competing and low on everything else, you can play a game of Monopoly. You have to win. You fight to the end to win. It's just a game, but you have to win. Once you get your TKI results, you say, my goodness, I have 5 alternatives. That broadens my repertoire. I have more choices to behave. I can be more effective because each conflict mode works best in a certain situation. So the first thing you learn with the TKI is, what are your limitations? Maybe you've developed a habit of only using 1 or 2 modes and not even realizing that there's other ways to approach conflict. And then you practice. We have role-playing exercises where someone who's high on competing can practice avoiding by saying, I'm not ready to make a decision now. Let's wait, or let's have further discussion next week and let's try again, as opposed to saying, you need to do it the way I want you to do it, period. So you practice, and there's many role-playing exercises where people can play out the different roles of using the different modes, and then they find out they get comfortable avoiding, accommodating, compromising, competing, collaborating. Now, the next skill is, how do you read the situation to determine which mode is best? That's very important. So you don't say, well, I'll randomly pick one of the 5. I can do all 5, so I'll randomly pick it. No, this is not a random process. You can't be effective that way. So you learn, what are the conditions when competing works best? For example, when you know you're right, which is of course dangerous sometimes, but or the issue is very important to you, it's not as important to the other person, and you explain why your needs are so important on this, and you help for other people to accommodate you. That's when competing can work well. Or when it's a problem which is not that important to you, but it is to your employees, and you want to develop them. So you let them make the decision, and you let them learn the consequences. Or compromising. You don't have a lot of time. The issue is of moderate importance. Let's just take a middle ground position and move on. Or collaborating, as I mentioned before, when it's really important to both people, and you have the conditions for an effective dialogue, there's trust, there's good communication, there's good listening. If it's really important, let's take the time to use collaborating so we can satisfy this issue. So you read the situation, and then you say which mode would work best. I should add there's a third skill, and that is, how do you enact each mode? I can compete by saying, if you don't do this, I'll never support you for another project again. That's one way to compete. Another way to compete is, let me share with you what I'm thinking so I can show you why this is so important to me, and maybe you can help me and take my position. And when something is more important to you than it is to me, I'll support you. That's competing, but it comes across very differently. Or take avoiding. It's avoiding when I say, I'm sick and tired of this discussion. I don't want to be here anymore. You stand up, you walk out of the room, you slam the door. That's avoiding. You withdrew from the situation. No one's getting their needs met. But you can also avoid by saying, I need more time. I want to think about it this week. I want to talk about it with some of my colleagues. Can we have another meeting next week? Now, that's also avoiding, but it's done with empathy, with compassion, with care. So what you realize as you learn conflict management is, one, knowing that you've got 5 conflict modes available to you all time. You learn how to read the situation given these needs and where people are and what is the culture and the reward system of the organization, what's the best mode. And then third, can I enact it in a way that draws people together and does not make them defensive and push them away?
This is very detailed, very thorough. I really appreciate this. I'm thinking of my time and tenure in the corporate world and how I would use some of this. And as I understand it so far here, it's a self-assessment sheet. We answer it, we fill it out. Now, this helps us learn more about ourselves and how to deal with it, or do we then go on a process after that? Can you give us a simple overview of that assessment?
Yes. Well, first, the standard instructions for the TKI is simply this: consider situations in which your needs differ from another person. How do you usually respond? We don't specify a situation. You're asked to, in essence, average your typical approach to conflict management across all the situations in your life. But what we learned is to change the instructions. And we sometimes have people in organizations take 2 TKIs. The first TKI is with the instructions in my group, in my department, in this organization, in the workplace. How do I usually respond when my wishes are different from those of other members? The second TKI is much like the general one. It says, in all other situations in my life outside this organization, how do I usually respond when my wishes differ from others? The difference between the two shows the impact of the organizational culture, strategy, structure, and reward system. So why would it be that you would respond to conflict very differently across all the other situations in your life, but you do it differently in the organization? And as I mentioned, people tend, particularly as you go down the hierarchy, to do more avoiding and accommodating in organizations. And yet on their TKI results, when they talk about all other situations, they're very assertive. So these are assertive people who come into the organization and have learned the hard way, typically, to play it safe because they don't want my real opinions here. I'm going to stay out of trouble. But when I'm out of the organization, I could be my usual self and assert myself. That's valuable information. And I show this information to senior management. In fact, I show 2 organization charts, and each box on the organization chart has the TKI model and the results. So the modes in high have a big circle, the modes in low have a low circle. And then you show the senior group what the chart looks like with the response to in this organization versus how people are behaving outside the organization. 2 different results. And senior management says, so these people are asserting themselves outside and sharing what they believe, but when they come inside this organization, they shut down. Why is that? We got to do something about it. Without that diagnostic information, senior management might simply say, there's nothing much to be done. We don't have a problem in conflict. But once you see the results and you see these different TKI outcomes, you say, we have a big problem. We're not using the wisdom, talent, and expertise of our members. We're squelching them. We have to do something about this. So that is valuable information that we can get from the TKI.
I love it. This is very, very good. Listeners can find out more at KilmannDiagnostics.com. That's KILMANN diagnostics.com. Is that right?
That's right. You got it, Tony.
All right. Please head on over there, check it out. And Once again, Dr. Kilmann, I really appreciate you giving us this information, coming on the show and telling us about this. Very interesting. We've all run into this. Now we have a better tool, or a very good tool to deal with it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure.